Good afternoon, everybody. I feel terribly privileged to be here talking to people like you today. So I'm going to talk about carbs in 20 minutes. It's a tall order, and I hope you'll forgive me if I don't include every single controversial issue. So these are my co-authors of the paper that I acknowledge for in lots and lots of ways. So I have a duality to declare. Everything about glycemic index, you can see there. So I think carbohydrates are very special. And I say this because apparently there is no known minimum requirement. In theory, at least men can tolerate a zero carbohydrate diet for at least 1 or 2 years. 2 men is our evidence. Yet we love them. And we eat a lot of them. A lot of our calories come from carbohydrates. We are hardwired to love sweetness. But paradoxically, we also love bland, starchy carbs. So think potatoes, rice, think lots of things that we combine with other foods, proteins and fats. And especially if we add some salt, we love starchy carbs. So another unique thing is that they are the only macronutrient that raises postprandial glycemia. And I'll be talking a lot about that in a minute. And it is the only macronutrient that is fermented at both ends of the gastrointestinal tract, in the mouth and in the large bowel. So we are still arguing about what is the optimal amount of carbohydrate for health, for long life, and for the prevention of chronic disease. I like to start with an evolutionary perspective. We have a brain which is 8 times bigger than you'd expect for our body size, and it runs on glucose. And the sources of glucose, fructose, and sucrose were ripe fruit, honey, and we know that there were other sources of sweetness as well. So the Hasda in Africa got 15% of their energy from honey. So did carbohydrates make us human? Some people think they did, because raw starch is not digestible by humans. Cooked starch releases not only energy, but also lots of micronutrients. And cooked starch is a source of glucose, a better source of glucose than sucrose. And it's fuel not just for the brain, but also the fetus. The fetus grows on the mother's maternal blood glucose. Some genes have changed because of our intake of carbohydrates. They include the AME1 gene, which produces salivary amylase. Some of us have 2 copies, some of us have 20 copies of this gene. The average is 6 to 8. And chimps have 2 copies. We're the only primate that has variable numbers of AME1. Lactase persistence developed in dairy populations around the world. And it developed independently in different parts of the gene. There was something useful about lactose, and there was something useful about starch. And of course, with the agricultural revolution came much higher intake of grains and starchy foods, but also deficiencies. Vitamin deficiencies, reduced height, and dental caries. Nita mentioned the PURE study. I'm just taking 2 graphics from that study, from that paper, and what you can see is that it shows that with increasing carbohydrate intake, you see higher total mortality and major cardiovascular disease. But for most of us, the range in carbohydrate intake is between 45 and 65% of energy. And within that range, there's very little difference. It's only when you get really high intakes. And Frank, our co-author, Frank, who believes that there is some residual confounding from the fact that the people with very high carbohydrate intake are also the poorest people with the lowest incomes. Okay, back to postprandial glycemia, which is my favorite topic. And you can see here, I'm just going to go through them quickly. There is plenty of evidence, disputable evidence that postprandial glycemia is related to the development of diabetes and cardiovascular disease. But you may not also recognize that it's relevant to pregnancy and birth weight and child obesity. And it's relevant to weight control and obesity, which I'll come back to. And it's also relevant to cognition, to memory, and even to dementia. So I'm going to just touch on a few of these in the time that I have. So there are multiple mechanisms by which postprandial glycemia or hyperglycemia has been related to metabolic damage. And it may be something to do with either the glycemia itself or the downstream effects of high insulin secretion. So it includes things like inflammatory responses, it includes fatty liver, it includes reduced fat oxidation, endothelial dysfunction, advanced glycated end products, as well as epigenetic programming, and eventually, in susceptible people, beta cell dysfunction. So, a fact that is really underappreciated. There is no meaningful relationship between carbohydrate chain length, simple versus complex, or between fiber contact and postprandial glycemia. It is one of the take-home messages I really want to leave with you. So starch can be digested slowly or quickly, depending on its physical form. So you can see that on the left, low GI, and GI in this context means glycemic index, not GI tract. And you can see the foods, the starches that are digested slowly reach the lower parts of the small intestine, where GLP-1 and L cells secrete GLP-1, which is a hormone associated with satiety and insulin sensitivity. So, depending on the state of gelatinization, we get either a high postprandial response or a low postprandial glucose response. And gelatinization is something that we do when we cook and when we process. But in the past, it was probably in a relatively mixed form of ungelatinized granules as well as solubilized granules. But these days, it's very easy to produce fully gelatinized starches. And this is the way I illustrate this. This product, Oats, can be made with steel cut processing, old-fashioned oats that take 5 or 10 minutes to cook, or instant oats, which take 60 seconds to cook. Nothing's been taken away, same fiber content, same exact macronutrient content. But when you look at the GI, on a scale from 0 to 100, steel cut oats 48, old-fashioned oats 65, instant oats 78. Okay? So, GI predicts postprandial glycemia even in mixed meals. There is no doubt about this. So you can see the meals from the arrows, you can see the spikes are higher, you can see over the course of 10 hours that glycemia is higher in those individuals consuming high glycemic index meals, mixed meals versus low glycemic index. But more importantly, if you take the maternal bloodstream, if you look at these pregnant women with risk factors for gestational diabetes, they haven't got gestational diabetes, they've just got risk factors. And you can see the difference in glycemia across 24 hours. And remember, the fetus is growing on the mother's maternal blood glucose levels. So, epigenetic programming, mitochondrial dysfunction, and those effects may go on from one generation to another, to another, to another. So, I mentioned glycemic load. It's simply a way of integrating the total carbohydrate intake with the GI. So the highest glycemic load is a diet based on lots of carbs from high GI sources, the very advice that we gave people for the last 30 years. Glycemic load is an independent risk factor for diabetes, cardiovascular disease, stroke in women, and certain cancers, but not all of the evidence is consistent. So I take one of Frank's papers here. You can see there that glycemic index and glycemic load have the highest relative risk associated with the development of type 2 diabetes. So this is a reductionist approach, and I hope Dari will forgive me for doing this here. But I also want you to see that cereal fiber, which does not affect glycemia generally, is associated with a reduced risk or a protective effect. Now, if we look at foods per se, what you can see is that white rice is associated with increased risk. You can see that whole grains reduced risk, and you can see that sugar-sweetened beverages are associated with higher risk. So, if we take the whole grain story versus refined grain storage, I think there's some residual confounding there, and I say that because I think that the people who eat whole grains are very unusual people. They're not just eating whole grains, they're doing a whole lot of other things that are enhancing their health, including reducing their salt intake. So grains are staples. They provide 30% of our energy generally, twice, 3 times as much as refined sugar. But we're going on and on about refined sugar. White rice we saw is associated with diabetes, whereas in observational studies, whole grains are associated with reductions, not just of diabetes, but CVD, cancer, and total mortality. But when you look at the randomized controlled trials, what you see is that there are mixed findings, on the whole pretty disappointing findings with respect to the proxy measures of cardiovascular risk. So they've been disappointing. People could argue that maybe they're too short, but generally it doesn't take long to produce improvements in those risk markers. But one of the things that is happening is that whole grains are no longer usually intact whole kernels. They're finely milled, the particle size is fine, so is the fiber. They may have a high glycemic load, and they include added sugars. On the other hand, what is consistent is that legumes, I call the dietary rock stars. They resemble intact whole grains, even when they're mashed, such as hummus. Low GI, high in plant protein, high in fiber, and phytonutrients. Consistently associated with lower risk, cardiovascular risk markers, lower risk of CVD itself. They're cheap and they're sustainable in the planetary sense, but they have some negatives that the food industry should work on, and that includes their palatability and the problem of flatulence. But the food industry can solve these problems easily. So, added sugars and weight, very controversial, causal or not. Is it just added sugar, or is it just sugar-sweetened beverages, or is it just Coke? Whatever. So, advice to reduce added sugars. Clearly, if you tell people to cut out sugars who normally eat sugars, they lose some weight, at least in the short term. On the other hand, if you tell them to eat more, they will eat more sugar. Of course, they'll gain weight. So, but the study, this meta-analysis, everybody kind of forgets this observation. To me, it was the most solid evidence in that paper, that if you substituted sugars with other carbohydrates, there was no change in body weight. But in children's studies, there is evidence that cutting sugar-sweetened beverages reduces weight. But in my opinion, this weight reduction is very, very tiny, and I want to show you how tiny. This is the girls in that study. I'm trying to simplify things. The red mark is the intervention group, the control group in blue, and you can see there that the differences, they're adolescents and they're growing, their weights, the difference is very, very tiny. Okay, so the Australian paradox. It's got me into lots of trouble. You can see there in blue, that's the FAO, WHO statistical data on availability of sugars in Australia. plotted against the increase in obesity in Australia. It's tripled in 30 years, and it's a steeper rise than in other countries. It's not just availability of sugar. There's lots of independent data from national surveys, from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, from industry. Sugar intake in Australia has fallen. So you can imagine what I think of the sugar tax idea. Okay? So, does fructose itself cause harm? Well, the answer is yes, in high doses. In low doses, most people don't recognize that actually fructose is changed to glucose in the gastrointestinal mucosa. And it's just absorbed as glucose into the portal stream and treated as glucose at the levels that most people consume. But at very high doses, you saturate those pathways in the mucosa. This is something that was published in Cell Metabolism this year, but according to Luke, it's been known for 100 years, this effect. So at those levels, yes, those levels that are above the 95th percentile, even in America, you will see these pathways that produce cardiovascular risk and particularly an increase in fatty liver. So the relevance to typical consumption is unclear. What we do know for sure is that high intake of fruit is not associated with harm. And half of the energy in fruit is fructose. Okay, so should we limit total carbs? Perhaps in certain vulnerable population groups who have intrinsic insulin resistance and a predisposition to beta cell dysfunction and therefore glucose intolerance. Perhaps we should explore that. And so when I say a low carbohydrate diet, I'm going to define myself as less than 100 grams a day, which is less than 30% of energy. It's actually quite hard to carry, in my opinion. It is hard diet to follow. Meta-analyses show greater weight loss in the short term, but there are also observational studies which suggest that a very low carbohydrate diet, particularly with a high ratio of protein, animal protein, is associated with harm. So I wonder whether it's sustainable behavior in the long term. Low glycemic load diets, on the other hand, where you modestly reduce carbohydrate and you change the carbs to low GI carbs, they're associated with long-term weight maintenance, such as in the weight loss maintenance, such as in the Dietary study. And I think that at the present time, you can recommend those low glycemic load diets to people safely with these risk factors. So the prevailing view of obesity is that we're just simply eating too much and we're moving too little and we've got these high levels of circulating metabolic fuels. Well, this is the problem, according to most people. But according to David, Ludwig, and Friedman, they support, and I support, the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, which is based on an excessive anabolic drive in adipose tissue. So this starts with diet quality as well as predisposition, and it suggests that you've got a reduction in circulating metabolic fuels which produce hunger and a reduction in your resting metabolic rate, and that produces obesity. So uncertainties remain, and that's because of both limited evidence and limits of evidence. So our problem with observational studies is we can't prove cause and effect. I think in some ways there are many effects. So when we're obese, we choose palatable foods. We need a larger energy intake. It makes sense to get your calories from sugar-sweetened beverages and French fries and chips, because they taste palatable and they give you your energy in a form you like, rather than broccoli. So randomized controlled trials have their problems too. People who actually volunteer for randomized controlled trials are different. And we have our problems of limited compliance. We have our problems with ethnicity. Can we tell people in Asia or of Asian origin to eat a Mediterranean-style diet that's flooded with olive oil? No. Low carbohydrate diets, in my opinion, would be very hard to sustain. I know that other people will not agree with me, but in a behavioral sense, but also in a planetary sense, that low carbohydrate diets may not be kind to the planet. So my conclusions, you can see there, I'm just repeating myself of what the things I've said. Perhaps most importantly, I want to say that I think a shortcut to a healthy diet that avoids the use of the word brown or whole grains is just to say low glycemic index and low glycemic load. So nutrition research, of course, requires funding of better, longer, randomized controlled trials, but there are limits to what the taxpayer is willing to pay. Thank you very much.